So we're now going to hear from Lauren Adams. Lauren Adams is the legal director of Women's Liberation Front, WOLF. She has written amicus briefs in support of women's sports, free speech, and free association, and she co-authored the Women's Bill of Rights. Lauren leads WOLF's lawsuit against the state of California challenging its gender identity prison policy. The title of Lauren's talk is Fighting for Single-Sex Prisons in the USA.
So this is a very important part of this fight because these are women who have no other choice over where they are and what circumstances they are in. It is also an area in which a lot of these extremist activists are kind of experimenting on these policies and trying to see where they can get them through because they know that there's an information asymmetry, that we don't know what's going on in there. And it's a very complicated fight because the US actually, we've got 50 states and we've got the federal government, and so there's different laws that all interact in different ways. So that's an important, unlike a lot of countries, we don't actually have anything that generally protects sex as a class. And we in fact have a lot of laws on the prison angle that go out of their way not to do so. We have the Bureau of Prisons, which is the federal system, and President Biden, or whoever the president is at the time, runs that. And so they have control over prisoners who are federal prisoners who have committed federal crimes. And there's also the 50 states, and each state has their own prison system for state level crimes. But there are federal laws that impact the states. And so one of them is executive orders can impact it. And many people know about Biden's executive orders related to gender identity and saying that sex as a definition now will include gender identity, and that has been implemented all over. This also interacts with, there's a law called the Prison Rape Elimination Act that is about 15, 20 years old. And what it does is it is supposed to help with oversight, data collection, et cetera, on prison rape. And what happened was it actually passed unanimously in Congress, but then when it went to the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Prisons, to create regulations that would implement the law, all of a sudden they were talking about this anticipation of possibly having cross-sex housing. So they talked about the circumstances by which you might place male offenders in the women's estate. So this was not a part of the original bill. It's a part of the regulations that prevent it. So this kind of set the stage for a lot of other things that happened afterwards. State by state, we've had a lot of litigation. So we have states like New Jersey, where there was recently a court settlement which implemented self-ID. But in states all over, there have been ad hoc cases where you have individual inmates who are suing under the Prison Rape Elimination Act, men suing to be placed in women's housing, saying that, you know, they are unsafe and they deserve to be housed in the women's estate. And there's been a lot of success there. So then you have places like California and Maine who have passed legislation to implement self-ID. And New York, the state of New York, is considering a similar law. You have states that do it by official policy. And there's no difference between conservative and liberal states, really, other than you have states like California that are much more expansive. But South Dakota is one of the most conservative states, and they have a policy that places some men in women's prisons. So it's really happening on a micro level. And then you don't even need official policy. States like Washington don't have any real written policy, and they are still transferring over men, some of the most horrible men. And there's been a lot of problems stemming from that. They're sex offenders, who have committed violence against women, serial killers, and there's very predictable results from this happening. So the California lawsuit, California had passed this bill, Senate Bill 132, which was the Transgender Agency Dignity Respect Act. And it lays out a bunch of things, but the most important provision is that it says that there's an entitlement to seek housing in the men's or the women's estate if you identify as transgender, non-binary, or intersex. And they specifically prohibit discrimination based on anatomy, based on physical characteristics, based on a factor that is present in the other facility. And what that means is that if there's even a single female sex offender in the women's prison, which there are a handful, then you cannot use sex offender status as a reason to deny transfer. They specifically say that no hormones are required, no surgery is required. So it is a free-for-all. And California has had, the results of this. Well, first I wanted to say, before I move on, these are our plaintiffs in the case. We're challenging the case, and we've got Tamikia Johnson here on the left. She is a former California State Patrol officer. She is serving 50 to life for killing her abusive husband during while he was attacking her. She has a 14-year-old daughter. She's in 10 years into this sentence, and she's had a number of interactions, including after this lawsuit started, where there's one of the men who's been trying to intimidate her, and she's been placed in administrative segregation, which is basically solitary for her own protection, a few times. And so we're working to try to fight back against that happening, that kind of retaliation. Nadia Romero in the middle there, she is 49 years old. She has a lifelong history of severe abuse by basically every man she's ever interacted with. She has said that actually one of the few silver linings of being incarcerated has been being largely a female environment. And ever since the men have been transferred over, she's been incarcerated for over 20 years now, and she has begun having severe mental health issues ever since being housed in the same unit as some of these men, and some of the interactions she's had, panic attacks and other problems that have developed. Crystal Gonzalez is 33 years old. She's a mother and grandmother. She was sexually assaulted by one of the men who had recently transferred. And the prison has refused to admit that it's a man. In all of the response paperwork, they refer to him as a transgender woman with a penis. She has asked them to stop. She has said that it is causing her distress, and they have continued to do this as well. And Janine Chandler is also serving time for an incident where she was defending herself against her abusive husband, who actually he's currently incarcerated in the men's prison for beating a subsequent partner almost to death. But she is a Muslim, and so one of the claims that she has is that she's required to have some sex separation in her living space. So these are the women who are speaking up. They are very brave. They are fierce. They are, we're not asking monetary damages for strategic reasons, and so there's nothing that they're getting out of this other than being the ones to stand up and put a target on their back and stand up for themselves and the women that they're in with. So we are incredibly grateful, and I'm gobsmacked by them basically and what they do. So impacts of this law. There have been 320 transfer requests from male to female facilities. 1/3 of them are sex offenders, according to public records requests. There have been about 45 transfers already, and so basically there's been reports of pregnancy that haven't been confirmed, although we have seen in New Jersey, we do have confirmed pregnancies under their self-ID law. there's been sexual assault, intimidation. We've got some recent, unfortunately, horrible reports just from this week about situations that will come to light. But you know, when I ask the women about what these men are like, right? Like, we don't know anything that's going on. It's all self-report. There's no pictures, there's no videos, and they all describe them as just men. So one of the things, I interviewed them yesterday, and they said basically they're out there bagging and sagging and wearing t-shirts and hats, and then they put a bra on when it's time to go talk to the counselor. And it's, you know, essentially they're there, not that it matters if there's any kind of legitimate claim to a gender identity, it doesn't matter. But the point is that this law is put into place to supposedly protect that group of people, and it's really just got a bunch of guys who decided to go in and be at the top of the pack and run things in the women's prison. It's pretty crazy. So, and a number of women have said there's a loss of rehabilitative benefits of a single-sex environment. And I mentioned that legitimate claim. I know that's a controversial thing to say, but in the legal argument that's being made is that they have the right as a state to, you know, they identify in this bill this group of people who they are trying to protect. So one of the legal arguments that you can make against that is that their bill has failed at that, because we also have, especially some of the, there's actually trans-identified men speaking out against it. Lier, our board chair, had said, yes, they want to come in and slam the door behind them. And I think that's a fair assessment. But I do think that they were caught off guard by some of the changes that have happened, because, you know, especially if they really truly consider themselves women, and then so kind of perceiving this new cultural environment. It's nothing else. I don't know how else to put that, but if you ever hear us talking about that, that's why we're talking about it that way. But it's been serious. I mean, there's not only 45, but there's 4,500 women in 2 different facilities. So really it's a small number overall, and it's caused absolute havoc so far. Absolute havoc. So the state moved to dismiss the case, and then they essentially, one of their primary arguments was they have the capability to safely implement this law, and they are willing to do so. So these proposed intervenors filed a motion to join the lawsuit. It's 4 incarcerated men. 2 of them are currently housed in women's housing. 2 of them are housed in men's housing and have outstanding transfer requests that have not been addressed. And so they're basically, they're coming out and actually saying, demanding full implementation, which would be the 300 plus transfer requests. They're going out of their way. They say in their filings that humans are not sexually dimorphic, that there's no differences in anatomy, physiology, et cetera, between women as a class and men as a class, that that you cannot use conviction or disciplinary history as a reason for denial of these things. And so what we're left with is that there is nothing. You literally check a box on your housing form that says you identify as transgender, non-binary, or intersex. You don't have to have a female gender identity. You could literally, whatever, you can make up your own thing. And so that's an interesting thing from a legal perspective too, is that they come back and say, oh, well, there's all this case law saying that transgender women have this right to do this, but the law doesn't even say that you have to identify as a trans woman. So there's these non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, whatever, in there too. And it's unclear to me what the basis is for saying that someone who is biological male and doesn't even pretend to identify as a woman, what entitlement there would be. So, and it's validation, it's agency and dignity, and that's kind of the theory behind it. So due to COVID emergency rules in the courts and backlogs, they are actually denying us a hearing. They say that they want to rule on the briefs, and we are going to try to revisit that because we think that a hearing is necessary to make sure that everyone is on the same page. They also say it could take months to get a ruling. So we are going to have to sit tight. Our next filing is due a week from Monday. So once that is, have to see what happens there. Some of the challenges that we're facing, again, I mentioned language, we're expecting that at some point they're going to try to make us use preferred pronouns or make us at least not call them men. We've seen that happen in so many other cases, including cases involving the ACLU in this circuit. So we are expecting that at some point. And the courts so far in many places have been very sympathetic to that argument of it's mean to say this. And we're going to fight that as much as we can, but it's something that we're going to have to deal with. But right now we're really talking past each other. Like I said, a lot of their arguments have to do with case law involving like post-op, and it has to do with healthcare, and need to get this gender affirming surgery kind of thing, and they're using it to say that anyone who has any kind of identity gets to transfer. So we're also seeing interactions with other case laws with other areas of the law that are problematic. There is case law, like I said, saying that kind of giving them whatever they want in a lot of ways, and so we have to fight an uphill battle against that. And then instead of something like a federal law saying, hey, by the way, we generally have single-sex prisons, or we always have single-sex prisons, we actually have laws like the Rape Elimination Act, which anticipates cross-sex housing. So they've even made arguments, their backup argument is, even if this law was struck down, PREA would still require them to have this same policy in place. So that's the argument that they're making. One of the other major challenges in this case that's not a legal challenge is client access. It's very difficult to adequately represent your client and make sure that they're safe when your opponent has them and gets to decide when you talk to them, gets to decide when what information that you have about them. And so it's very challenging and very, often concerned for their safety. And if you don't hear from them, you don't know if they're just being kept from the phone or if they're in segregation or what's going on. So that's an ongoing challenge. If any more information, stop SB 132. It actually leads to our landing page for this suit on our website. So that will always have case updates, including documents for anyone who likes to read all of the court documents. And you can also, there's links to donate through there. Litigation is very expensive, especially extensive use of outside counsel, and we're hiring expert witnesses and things like that. It's very, it's fully funded by donations. So how do we fight back, right? One of the things that was mentioned is we have a Women's Bill of Rights, which we co-wrote with Independent Women's Voices. They're a right-leaning, conservative kind of group, women's group. They are a lot more moderate on some things. They don't take a position on most LGB issues. They are very limited in their statements on like abortion, and they're really focused on kind of a libertarian economic conservative kind of thing. So we run into less issues working with them compared to some other groups, although as most people know, WOLF will, work with whoever we need to work with to be effective. And that's a controversial take at times, but it's been very effective for us to get the access and the resources that we need to be able to kind of do meaningful change. So we wrote this, and it basically addresses language at its core. It's not an expansive UK Equality Act type thing where there's a guarantee. It says this is what sex is, this is what woman is. It has a number of findings about the differences between men and women, and it endorses the need for single-sex spaces. So the idea is that we need to have these definitions in law. We can't have these bureaucrats and these crazy groups like the ACLU running around and saying that sex has always meant gender identity, or you have ACLU attorneys saying that the concept of biological sex was invented to oppress trans people. That's what we're dealing with, the kind of sort of lunacy on that. So We were really hoping for bipartisan endorsement, and we think that actually there might be some possibility of that at the state level if it's introduced there. But it was introduced this week, just yesterday or Thursday, as a resolution in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. It's got cross-partisan support from women's rights groups, including the U.S. Branch of Women's Declaration. It's very consistent with the Women's Declaration. And you can go to womensbillofrights.com and endorse that as well. And so it's a really big deal. I think, obviously, personally speaking, as what I consider myself a reasonable, left-leaning, usually Democrat person, I don't see any reason why a Democrat wouldn't support this, because it really just creates a level playing field for the policy that we're talking about and proceeding from there. But we'll see, because we can't control the talking points the Republicans use to talk about it. But it's a really huge deal to be able to kind of have this introduced into Congress. It's a really huge deal. And so we'll see where it goes. And we're also going to be lobbying for it at the state level, especially in friendlier climates. There's a number of red states that have had some Democratic support for sports bills and other, child transition bans and things like that, because, and so we're doing some outreach to there, because they, not everyone is on board with this. So I mentioned, donation. Talking to people is a huge deal. There is absolutely a media blackout. Most people do not know what is going on. Even the people who would otherwise be the most sympathetic to something like, prison type policies, they just don't know what's going on. If you say, actually, according to the state of California, 1/3 of the people who have requested transfer are sex offenders. That's just a fact. And people are not dumb, and they can make their own conclusions from that. And it's really important. The media is really blocking things. So if you can do letters to editor, op-eds in your location, that's a really important piece of it as well. They don't report on these things. Like, they'll ask for quotes, and you send them a quote and they cut out the most important parts. And you know what? If you are able to testify, then testify if there's bills. Maryland, for those who don't know, is a very blue state. It's a very, very, very liberal state. So exactly the kind of state that would implement self-ID. And there was a bill there that was modeled after the California bill last month. And Wolf board member and advisory council member, along with Keep Prison Single Sex, showed up. The U.S. branch of there showed up to testify, and they let it die. They let it die in committee. The committee never voted on it. So that's a huge deal. It was going to go into effect in October, and now it's not. And so if we can just keep that going and being able to do that, that's very, very important. And for those international, and actually just everyone, find out what's going on in your own states or countries. Do not assume that just because you live in a right-wing area, or just because you haven't heard what's going on, that it's not happening, because there are a lot of places where they're just doing it. No one told them they could, no one told them they should, but they're just doing it. And there's important work, that's been done to, I know April Morrow has done a huge amount of outreach in Washington, and it's a huge source of a lot of information that we have about what's going on in there. So yeah, there's a lot going on. We feel really confident that at least some of our claims will pass motion to dismiss, because there's just such a genuine controversy. Such factual disputes, and there's more information that's going to be coming out soon, and just cannot be denied or cannot be dismissed. So I really, really appreciate having a chance to come and speak about this, because it is really important, and it's so horrifying that it would never occur to you that it was going on if you didn't already know.